Hey guys, and thanks for tuning in. In tonight's video, we dive into the world of Elizabeth of Austria. On the outside, she was known for her beauty and her grace, but beneath the surface, there was a way more darker side. So tonight, we're going to explore the little-known facts of her life and uncover some little-known secrets. But before we begin, if you enjoy this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribe. Get in your comfy place, and let's begin. She was called the most beautiful woman in Europe, an empress who seemed more like a myth than a queen. Elizabeth of Austria, better known as Sisi, was the face of elegance, grace, and fairy tale romance. But behind the dazzling portraits and diamond stars in her hair was a woman whose life was far more stranger, darker, and more fascinating than most people realize. She was obsessed with her beauty to the point of torment. She spent hours each day on extreme exercise routines, and she rebelled against the stiff traditions of the Habsburg court. Her story includes scandal, tragedy, wanderlust, and even a shocking assassination that stunned the world. Today, we're diving into the insane, unbelievable, and often haunting facts about Empress Elisabeth of Austria, the royal who refused to be tamed. Before we dive into the wild and unbelievable details of her life, let's take a moment to understand who Elizabeth of Austria, better known as Sisi, really was. Born in 1837 in Munich, Bavaria, Elizabeth wasn't raised to be an empress. In fact, she grew up far from the strict formalities of court life. Her childhood was unusually free for a noble woman of her time. She loved horseback riding, spending time in nature, and escaping the confines of rules and etiquette. She was known for her independent spirit and striking beauty, but no one expected that one day she would become one of the most famous royals in all of Europe. That twist of fate came when she accompanied her older sister Helene on a trip to meet Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria. Helene was supposed to be his bride, but when Franz Joseph met Elizabeth, he was instantly captivated. Against all expectations, he chose the younger, livelier sister as his empress. At just 16 years old, Sisi was suddenly thrust into one of the most powerful courts in the world. But life at Habsburg court was nothing like the freedom she had known as a child. The Viennese court was rigid, suffocating, and filled with traditions and expectations that weighed heavily on the young empress. She often clashed with her formidable mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie, who tried to control every aspect of her life, from how she raised her children to how she behaved in public. Despite the constraints, Elizabeth quickly became an icon. She was admired across Europe for her beauty, her elegance, and her mysterious aura. Yet beneath the surface, she was deeply restless. She traveled constantly, shunning the stiff ceremonial life of Vienna. She was equally adored and misunderstood, seen by some as the ultimate fairy tale empress, and by others as a troubled, rebellious soul who never truly found peace. And it's in this tension between the myth and the reality that Sisi's life becomes so fascinating. Because behind the legend of a glamorous empress lies a woman whose habits, choices, and personal struggles were often shocking, eccentric, and sometimes downright unbelievable. All right. Let's get into our first insane fact about Empress Elisabeth of Austria, Sisi. And trust me, this one already sets the tone for just how different this woman was. Sisi was absolutely obsessed with her looks. And when I say obsessed, I don't mean she had a 12-step skincare routine or she loved Sephora sales. No, this woman treated her beauty like a full-time career. If Tuk beauty influencers had existed in the 1800s, she would have been the undisputed queen of them all, and her pride and joy her hair. And this wasn't just any hair. It was legendary. Thick, wavy, chestnut brown locks that fell all the way down to her ankles. Her ankles. Imagine Rapunzel, but instead of being locked in a tower, she was locked in the Habsburg court. Taking care of her hair was an entire ordeal. Washing it took hours. Combing it, also hours. In fact, she had a full-time hairdresser whose only job was to deal with the massive mane. And get this, Sisi hated sitting while her hair was being done, so she would use that time to study languages. She learned Greek and Hungarian basically while getting her hair detangled. Meanwhile, if I can get through brushing my hair without breaking it off in frustration, I consider that a win. And her hair routine wasn't even the half of it. Sisi was obsessed with keeping her waist as tiny as humanly possible, around 19 inches. 19. That's about the circumference of a modern-day laptop screen. She achieved this with extremely tight corsets and a very strict diet that makes juice cleanses practically look like buffets. She often ate almost nothing, surviving on milk, broth, or squeezed oranges. At one point, she even tried a diet where she lived off of raw meat juice. That's right, meat juice. But the most bizarre part were her face masks. Modern skincare gives us things like clay masks, sheet masks, and maybe a nice avocado mix. Sisi, she went for things like raw veal masks, as in, she literally put raw meat on her face overnight to keep her skin fresh. Imagine being a servant in the imperial palace, walking past the empress's bedroom, and knowing she's in there, asleep, wearing beef. Forget royalty, this is the original beef face. Now we can laugh at how extreme this all sounds, but there's a tragic side too. Sisi's beauty obsession wasn't just vanity. It was almost like a prison. She felt enormous pressure to stay perfect because she was constantly in the public eye. The moment she had the tiniest wrinkle, people gossiped about it. So she basically turned beauty into a kind of battle she fought every single day. Still, I think we can all agree, if there's anyone in history who would have been sponsored by every beauty brand on Instagram, it's definitely Sisi. Okay, so we've covered Sisi's insane beauty routine, but it doesn't stop there, because Empress Elisabeth was basically the original fitness influencer, like centuries before gym culture was even a thing. If she had an Instagram today, it would just be endless gym selfies, horse riding reels, and motivational quotes about abs. Sisi was absolutely obsessed with staying slim and fit. And remember, we're talking about the mid-1800s, when most royals were busy lounging around in palaces, eating banquets, and slowly dying of gout. But not Sisi. She was different. Every single day, she worked out for hours. She had her own personal gym installed in the palace, which was basically unheard of at that time. She had rings, parallel bars, dumbbells, and even her own exercise bench. Imagine walking into the imperial palace, expecting chandeliers and ballrooms, and instead finding the empress just casually doing pull-ups. Honestly, I think it's kind of iconic. But her favorite form of exercise was horseback riding, and not just casual, leisurely rides through the gardens. She was hardcore. She became one of the best equestrians in all of Europe. She could ride for 8 hours straight across rough terrain, leaving even professional riders in the dust. Nobles who tried to keep up with her often gave up halfway, gasping for breath, while Sisi was still galloping into the distance, like some kind of royal action hero. And she didn't stop at horses. She was also an incredible hiker and walker. Like she would casually walk 10, 15, sometimes 20 miles in a single day, as if it were nothing. She often left her ladies in waiting, trailing behind, wheezing, and begging for mercy, while Sisi just powered on like the world's first Fitbit addict. Of course, her fitness obsession tied right back into her appearance. She was determined to keep her famously tiny waist, and exercising nonstop was her way of making sure she never gained a single ounce. But still, it wasn't just for vanity. For Sisi, exercise was freedom. It was how she escaped the rigid, suffocating life of the Viennese court. When she was on a horse or out in the mountains, she wasn't the Empress anymore. She was just Elisabeth, wild and untouchable. Now let's be honest. If you or I were royal in the 1800s, we'd probably just be eating pastries and napping on fancy furniture all day. But Sisi, she was basically inventing CrossFit before it was cool. Alright, so if Sisi had a catchphrase, it probably would have been, "Catch me if you can." Because this woman was obsessed with traveling. And I don't mean she had a nice vacation now and then. I mean, she could not stop moving. Staying in one place for too long literally drove her crazy. Once she escaped the rigid life of the Viennese court, she never wanted to go back. In fact, she spent so little time in Vienna that people actually joked the city should build a statue of her luggage instead of her, because they saw that way more often than they saw the Empress herself. Sisi would hop from country to country like she was collecting stamps on a passport. Greece was one of her absolute favorite destinations. She became totally fascinated with Greek culture, so much so that she learned ancient Greek, and she read classical poetry. But Greece wasn't her only stop. She wandered all over Europe, spending time in Hungary, England, Ireland, Switzerland, Italy, you name it. She went there. And she didn't travel like a low-key backpacker. She traveled with entire entourages, fancy carriages, and trunks upon trunks of clothes. Picture the ultimate overpacker, but just make it royal. And why all the constant travel? Well, part of it was escapism. Sisi hated the rigid duties of being an empress. Every trip she took was like running away from her problems, but with better scenery. And part of it was just her restless spirit. She wanted freedom, she wanted space, and she wanted to feel alive in a way that sitting in a palace throne room simply couldn't give her. Of course, her endless wandering made her something of a legend. She became this mysterious figure, never where people expected her to be, always a little elusive. The people in Vienna might have thought of her as their empress, but in reality, she was more like Europe's wandering ghost, just constantly on the move. Basically, if there had been frequent flyer miles in the 1800s, Sisi would have had enough to buy her own airline. Now, you might think of Empress Elisabeth as this glamorous, horseback riding, globe-trotting beauty queen, but she also had kind of an emo side. And the way she expressed it? Poetry. Lots and lots of poetry. Sisi didn't just dabble in writing. She was obsessed with it. She wrote thousands of lines of poetry, most of it hidden away in secret notebooks. And forget about sweet love poems or flowery odes. Her writing was intense, dark, and sometimes straight up depressing. Her verses were full of themes like loneliness, freedom, death, and despair. She often wrote about feeling trapped, about being a caged bird, and about how much she longed to escape her royal life. In fact, she sometimes compared herself to the Greek hero Achilles, not because of the glory, but because of the tragic fate. And this is where things got even stranger. She genuinely became obsessed with Achilles. She had statues of him in her palace. She memorized passages about him, and she basically made him her personal role model. But here's the thing. Her poetry gave us a window into her mind, and it wasn't really a happy place. On the outside, she was the most beautiful woman in Europe. But on the inside, she was deeply melancholic, almost tortured. Her verses are basically the 19th century equivalent of sad song lyrics you cry to at 2 a.m. Now, was her poetry any good? Well, let's just say it hasn't exactly made it into the great literary canon. Critics today describe it as a bit dramatic, a bit self-indulgent. But honestly, who cares? Because the fascinating part isn't the quality, it's what it reveals about her. This woman, who seems like a fairy tale princess, was secretly scribbling down pages and pages of dark, moody poems about how she felt trapped and miserable. So yeah, Sisi wasn't just an empress. She was basically the original angsty teen with a secret diary, except her diary was filled with thousands of poems, and instead of teenage heartbreak, it was imperial depression. Alright, if you thought Sisi's beauty and exercise routines were extreme, wait until you hear about her diet, because honestly, this might be one of the strangest parts of her life. Sisi had a complicated relationship with food. On one hand, she was absolutely determined to stay as slim as possible. On the other hand, some of the things she ate, or didn't eat, were just plain weird. Let's start with the basics. Most days, she ate almost nothing. Sometimes her meal was just a glass of milk, or some broth, or a squeezed orange. Not orange juice, by the way. Literally oranges she squeezed herself to drink the liquid. If she were alive today, she'd be that one friend who shows up at brunch and says, "Oh, I'm not really hungry, I'll just have the lemon water." But Sisi took it even further. She went on all kinds of strange diets. One of her favorites was living on raw meat juice. Yeah, you heard that right. It was raw meat juice. Her staff would actually press rare cuts of steak and give her the liquid to drink as some kind of bizarre protein shake. Somewhere, Dracula's nodding in approval. And then there's dessert, or rather, the lack of it. Sisi barely touched sweets, which honestly feels like a crime when you're living in Vienna, the land of pastries. Imagine walking past all those gorgeous Austrian bakeries and saying, "No thanks, I'll just sip my veal smoothie." Now here's the really wild part. Sisi didn't just eat weird things. She was also obsessed with weighing herself, constantly. She actually traveled with her own scale, like it was a carry-on suitcase. No matter where she went, the scale came with her. Imagine rolling up to some fancy palace abroad, opening your luggage, and instead of gowns and jewels, the Empress just pulls out a set of scales. It sounds funny, and let's be real, it is kind of hilarious, but it also shows how much pressure she puts on herself. Sisi wasn't just dieting to stay fashionable. She was basically waging war against her own body, trying to control it at all costs. But still, you can't deny the sheer dedication. While everyone else in 19th century Europe was eating rich, buttery feasts, Sisi was out there, pioneering the first ever meat juice cleanse. Now, if you thought Sisi was a glamorous social butterfly who loved the spotlight, think again, because one of the weirdest things about her later life was her obsession with hiding her face. When Sisi was young, she was absolutely celebrated as the most beautiful woman in Europe. Painters, photographers, and poets all raved about her legendary looks. But as she got older, she became completely paranoid about people noticing the tiniest wrinkle or sign of aging. Remember, this is a woman who basically turned beauty maintenance into a full-time job. So once she left that perfect image slipping away, she did everything in her power to disappear from view. And I mean literally disappear. Sisi developed this habit of going out in public completely veiled or hidden behind a fan. She'd hold up her fan so high that people would only see her eyes, or sometimes not even that. Think about it. She was the most famous woman in Austria, and people might pass her on the street without even realizing, because she was hidden, like some mysterious Victorian Batman. She even refused to be photographed later in life. The last known photos of her are from her early 40s, because after that, she flat out refused to let anyone take her picture. She wanted the world to remember her only as young, beautiful, and perfect, not as a normal person who aged like everyone else. It's like she invented the Instagram filter before Instagram even existed. And she took it seriously. Servants reported that she'd often wear thick black veils when traveling, so even when people knew she was somewhere, they could barely catch a glimpse of her face. Imagine being a tourist in Switzerland in the 1890s and realizing you just walked past the Empress of Austria, but all you saw was a floating fan. On one hand, it's kind of sad. She had been so admired for her beauty that she felt like she wasn't allowed to grow old in public. On the other hand, it definitely added to her myth. She became this almost ghostly figure, rarely seen, always hidden, more rumor than reality. People whispered about what she looked like because so few actually knew. So yeah, while most royals had portraits painted every other week, Sisi was basically inventing the art of avoiding paparazzi long before celebrities started hiding from cameras under hoodies. So here's one of the wildest political quirks about Sisi. She was absolutely obsessed with Hungary. And not in the casual, oh, I love the food and the scenery kind of way. I mean full on, Hungary is my second homeland level obsession. The Austrian court in Vienna? Sisi hated it. It was stiff, formal, and full of rules that she couldn't stand. But Hungary? That was where she felt free. The Hungarian nobility adored her because she actually made the effort to connect with them. She didn't just smile politely and wave. She went all in. She learned Hungarian, which, by the way, is considered one of the hardest languages in the world. And she didn't just speak it. She spoke it fluently. If Duolingo had existed in the 1800s, she would have maxed out every streak. Her closeness with Hungary wasn't just cultural, it was political. In the 1860s, Austria was facing a lot of problems. The empire was struggling, nationalism was on the rise, and the Hungarians were demanding more independence. Enter Sisi, who lobbied her husband, Emperor Franz Joseph, to make peace with them. And guess what? She actually pulled it off. In 1867, thanks in large part to her influence, the Austro-Hungarian Compromise was signed. Suddenly, Hungary wasn't just part of Austria's empire, it became an equal partner. And Franz Joseph wasn't just emperor anymore. He and Sisi were crowned king and queen of Hungary. Now keep in mind, Franz Joseph wasn't exactly known for being flexible, but Sisi could charm him like nobody else. She knew exactly how to soften him up, and she used that influence to get him to agree with her on Hungary. Honestly, it was the ultimate example of happy wife, happy life. Except instead of deciding where to eat dinner, she convinced him to restructure half the empire. The Hungarians adored her for it. They saw her as their champion, their advocate, almost like she was one of them. In fact, while people in Vienna often gossiped about Sisi and criticized her eccentricities, in Hungary, she was basically a national hero. They put her face on souvenirs, they cheered her in the streets, and to this day, she's still remembered there with a lot of affection. So yeah, while Sisi technically ruled Austria, her heart belonged to Hungary. If it had been up to her, she probably would have just packed up, moved there full time, and never looked back. So let's talk about something we all love: sleep. Except Sisi didn't exactly sleep the way normal people do. Her nightly routine was just as strange and over the top as everything else in her life. First of all, she had a terrible case of insomnia. She hated going to bed early and often stayed up way into the night reading, writing poetry, or pacing around. But when she did finally decide to sleep, it wasn't on some plush royal bed with silk sheets like you'd imagine. No, Sisi preferred things that made her sleep uncomfortable. She often slept on a metal bed instead of a soft one, and sometimes even with a wet towel wrapped around her waist, because she believed it would keep her figure slim. Yeah, you heard that right. She was literally willing to go to bed soggy for the sake of her waistline. Imagine being the maid who had to deal with that damp laundry every morning. But it gets even weirder. Sisi also liked to sleep with raw veal pressed against her skin, just like her infamous veal face masks. Sometimes it was on her face, sometimes on her hands. She believed it kept her skin youthful. Meanwhile, the palace dogs probably thought every night was a midnight snack opportunity. On top of all of this, she was so paranoid about her privacy that she even had locks installed on her bedroom doors, making it hard for servants, or even Franz Joseph himself, to come in. For a royal couple, they lived almost completely separate lives, and nighttime was definitely Sisi's alone time. So yeah, while most royals were tucked into feather beds under velvet blankets, Sisi was over there inventing the concept of beauty sleep, but taking it way too literally. Now, when you think of 19th century royalty, you probably picture pearls, ball gowns, and shiny crowns, and not tattoos. But guess what? Empress Elisabeth of Austria, our girl Sisi, was way ahead of her time. She actually had some ink. Yeah, the glamorous empress with diamond stars in her hair also had a tattoo on her body. The story goes that during one of her many sea voyages, because remember, Sisi was basically the original frequent flyer, except with ships, she visited a Greek island and decided to get a tattoo. And it wasn't some delicate little flower or a dainty little symbol. Sisi went bold. She got an anchor tattooed on her shoulder. That's right, the Empress of Austria was rocking sailor ink. Now, this was absolutely shocking for the time. In the 1800s, tattoos weren't trendy. They weren't seen as fashionable or artsy. They were associated with sailors, soldiers, and let's just say the rougher crowds. But for an imperial empress to get one, it was downright scandalous. Imagine if Queen Victoria had strolled into Buckingham Palace with a full sleeve. That's the level of jaw drop we're talking about here. So why did she do it? Well, part of it was probably her love for the sea. The ocean was one of her biggest escapes from her suffocating royal duties. So the anchor made sense as a personal symbol. But let's be real, it was also a rebellious streak. Sisi loved breaking away from expectations. She hated being boxed in as the perfect empress. So getting a tattoo was her way of saying, I'm not just a pretty face in a crown. I'm my own person. And honestly, it worked. That one little anchor made her not only one of the most stylish women of the era, but also one of the edgiest. Today, tattoos are everywhere, but in the 19th century, Sisi was basically the royal trendsetter who did it first. So yeah, Empress Elisabeth, horse-riding action star, beauty-obsessed gym rat, poetry-writing night owl, and secretly a tattooed rebel. Alright, we've laughed at Sisi's beauty routines, her insane workouts, her tattoos, and even her meat juice diet. But now, it's time to talk about the most shocking and tragic fact of all, her passing. In 1898, Sisi was 60 years old, and true to form, she was still constantly traveling. At this point, she was spending a lot of time in Switzerland, where she could live quietly, away from the rigid formality of the Viennese court that she hated so much. But her endless wandering also made her quite vulnerable. On September 10th, in Geneva, Sisi was walking alongside the lake with just one lady in waiting. She was dressed simply, carrying her trademark fan. To the people around her, she looked like just another elegant noblewoman on holiday. Nobody realized this mysterious lady in black was actually the Empress of Austria. And that's when it happened. An Italian anarchist named Luigi approached her. He wasn't even specifically targeting Sisi. He just wanted to assassinate a royal to make a political statement. He carried a sharpened file, basically a homemade knife, and as he passed by, he struck her once in the chest. At first, Sisi didn't even realize how badly she was injured. She actually got up, tried to walk back to her hotel, and even made it inside. But the wound was fatal. Within an hour, the Empress was gone. The glamorous, elusive woman who had spent her life trying to escape the burdens of royalty had been brought down by a random act of violence. The news stunned Europe. People couldn't believe that this is how Sisi would go, not on a throne, not surrounded by ceremony, but in the street, at the hands of a stranger. In some ways, it felt fittingly tragic, almost poetic. Sisi had always been restless, always searching, always haunted by darkness, and her end was as dramatic as her life. Her passing cemented her myth forever. Sisi wasn't just remembered as a beautiful empress. She became a legend, a tragic heroine, frozen in time, forever young in portraits, forever untouchable in memory. We've seen Sisi through the lens of her insane habits, obsessions, and quirks. But here's something we haven't talked about yet. What it was actually like to live with her day in and day out. Because being Empress Elizabeth's lady-in-waiting wasn't some glamorous fairy tale gig. Oh no. It was more like a full-time survival challenge. Imagine it for a second. You're expecting a cushy palace job, fancy dresses, elegant dinners, maybe a little gossip with royalty, but then you realize your boss is Sisi, a woman who walks 20 miles before breakfast, spends 3 hours having her ankle-length hair brushed, refuses to eat like a normal person, and might disappear for months on end with only a few hours' notice. Keeping up with her wasn't just exhausting, it was nearly impossible. Her ladies-in-waiting often complained in their diaries about how brutal it was. Trying to follow her on those endless hikes? Pure torture. Most of them ended up trailing behind, gasping for breath, while Sisi marched ahead like some kind of unstoppable machine. But it wasn't just the physical side. Sisi could be distant, moody, and very private. She didn't like being told what to do, and she hated the strict routines of court life, which meant her staff was constantly caught between the rigid expectations of the Habsburg palace and Sisi's rebellious streak. It was a balancing act that left most of them totally worn down. Working for Sisi wasn't about serving tea and attending balls. It was about keeping pace with a restless, complicated woman who never wanted to stand still. And the more you learn about her daily life, the clearer it becomes. Being one of Sisi's ladies-in-waiting was probably the hardest royal job in 19th century Europe. Alright, so let's step into the shoes of one of Sisi's ladies-in-waiting. Forget everything you thought you knew about cushy palace life, because your average day, serving Empress Elizabeth, was a marathon of weirdness, exhaustion, and anxiety. The day usually started early, very early. Sisi was a notorious insomniac, so if she decided to rise at dawn, guess what? You were also up at dawn. The first task was usually hair duty. Remember, her hair was floor length, so brushing it alone could take up to 3 hours. That meant sitting in silence, carefully untangling strand after strand, while Sisi practiced languages, or read. It sounds simple, but ladies-in-waiting, they dreaded it. Why? Because if even a single hair broke off, Sisi would get upset. She was that protective of it. Imagine the pressure. Don't break a hair. Next came exercise, and if Sisi was exercising, you were exercising too, or at least attempting to keep up. She'd walk miles and miles, or ride horses for hours, and her ladies-in-waiting were expected to follow. Most of them couldn't keep up with her insane stamina, so there are plenty of diary entries describing how they collapsed from exhaustion, while Sisi just kept marching on, barely breaking a sweat. Basically, she was running her own imperial boot camp, and you were the unwilling recruit. When it came time for meals, don't get too excited. Remember, Sisi hardly ate anything. So while the palace kitchens prepared lavish spreads for the emperor and the court, you might be stuck, awkwardly watching your empress nibble on an orange or sip some broth. Worse, sometimes her meal was just raw meat juice. Now let's talk about the afternoons. This was when her wanderlust kicked in. If she wasn't in Vienna, she might be on a carriage ride through the countryside, or taking a steamer across a lake, or galloping through the woods. And since she traveled constantly, her ladies-in-waiting had to pack, unpack, and repack her endless luggage. Seriously, Sisi traveled with trunks upon trunks of clothing, fans, veils, exercise equipment, and even her personal scale. Imagine being in charge of lugging all of that across Europe every few weeks. It was less palace service and more imperial moving company. So you might think things would calm down in the evenings. But no, this was when her odd beauty rituals began. Veil face masks, vinegar washes, and sometimes even sleeping with wet clothes wrapped around her body. Ladies-in-waiting had to prepare all of this, which means your day could literally end with you handing raw meat to the most glamorous woman in Europe. And just when you thought you'd finally get some rest, remember, Sisi often stayed up into the night, writing poetry, which meant you had to be available just in case she wanted company, or a book fetched, or another candle lit. So much for an early bedtime. In short, being Sisi's lady-in-waiting was exhausting, frustrating, and sometimes downright bizarre. Instead of waltzes and ball gowns, you got veal facials, marathon hikes, and constant packing. Serving her wasn't just a job, it was survival. Now all of that sounds exhausting enough, but here's where things get even more fascinating. Because it wasn't just the endless walking, the packing, or the midnight beauty rituals that made serving Sisi such a nightmare. It was the requests. You see, Sisi was no ordinary royal. She wasn't asking for extra lace on her gown or another ballroom chandelier. No, her requests were in a league of their own. Quirky, obsessive, sometimes just downright bizarre. And if you were her lady-in-waiting, you had to be ready for anything. Alright, so let's talk about the requests. Because if you worked for Sisi, you had to be ready for anything, from the mildly annoying to the totally absurd. This was not your average, fetch me a glass of water kind of empress. Nope, Sisi's requests were as eccentric as she was. Sisi was obsessed with not being seen, especially later in her life. That meant her ladies-in-waiting had to master the fine art of holding a fan at exactly the right angle to shield her face. Too low, and the sun might hit her skin. Too high, and someone could catch a glimpse of her. And she was picky. Imagine standing there, arm cramping, while she snapped higher, lower, tilted slightly to the left. It was less royal service, and more like working stage lighting for the world's most high-maintenance theater star. Then there was the travel madness. Sisi basically lived out of a suitcase. But these weren't ordinary suitcases. They were trunks, dozens of them, and they weren't filled with essentials either. She traveled with things like her personal scale. Yeah, her staff had to lug a full-size scale from palace to palace, just so Sisi could weigh herself daily. Forget jewels or crowns. The one item she absolutely had to have was the 19th century equivalent of a bathroom scale. Imagine being the poor servant whose job it was to carry that thing through customs. Beauty prep was a whole other battlefield. Her veil face masks didn't just appear out of thin air. Someone had to source fresh veal, prepare it, and then carefully set it out for Sisi's nightly skincare ritual. So congratulations, you're not only a lady-in-waiting, you're also an honorary butcher. And that's on top of managing her vinegar baths, her endless bottles of special tonics, and her custom-made exercise equipment. And let's not forget about the horses. Sisi was obsessed with riding, and she demanded the best horses, the best gear, and the best stables wherever she went. Her staff had to arrange all of this in advance of her travels, sometimes in countries where people weren't exactly thrilled to lend out their best stallions. And finally, the silence rule. Sisi valued her privacy so much that she often demanded her ladies-in-waiting remain completely silent. unless they were spoken to. So imagine you're trailing behind her on a 20-mile hike, gasping for breath, desperately wanting to beg for a break. But nope, the rule is silence. The best you could do was pray that she slowed down, which she never did. So yeah, being Sisi's lady-in-waiting wasn't about glittering gowns and palace parties. It was about carrying scales across Europe, holding fans at impossible angles, sourcing raw meat for face masks, and trying not to collapse during casual hikes. Serving her, it wasn't just a job. It was a crash course in dealing with one of history's most eccentric royals. Now, we spent a lot of time diving into Sisi's world, her weird habits, her impossible demands, and the sheer chaos of serving her at court. But to really understand her life, we need to talk about the man at the center of it all, her husband, Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria. Because while Sisi was wild, restless, and constantly breaking the mold, Franz was her complete opposite. Where she was unpredictable, he was rigid. Where she craved freedom, he clung to duty. It was almost like fate decided to throw two people together who couldn't have been more different, and then gave them the crown of one of the most powerful empires in Europe. And make no mistake, Franz Joseph wasn't just the emperor in name. He was the definition of a workaholic ruler. His entire life revolved around the monarchy, the army, and the endless paperwork that came with running an entire empire that stretched across half of Europe. While Sisi was off galloping across the countryside or disappearing to Greece, Franz Joseph was glued to his desk in Vienna, signing documents, reviewing reports, and following the same exact routine, day after day. To some people, that made him admirable, steady, reliable, a man who put his empire above all else. To others, it made him boring. But either way, his personality couldn't have clashed more with Sisi's, and that clash defined their entire marriage. An emperor who embodied discipline and duty, paired with an empress who wanted nothing more than to escape them. So who was Franz Joseph really? How did he become emperor? What kind of ruler was he? And how on earth did he manage to live with someone as unconventional as Sisi? Let's take a closer look at the man who wore the crown, and how his iron sense of duty shaped not just his empire, but also his marriage. So let's talk about Emperor Franz Joseph. Not the empire, not the wars, not the politics, but the man himself. Because his personality and daily routine were legendary, and honestly, kind of exhausting just to hear about. Franz Joseph was the ultimate workaholic. If Sisi was a free spirit who hated rules, Franz Joseph was the exact opposite. He loved them. He lived his life like clockwork, following the same routine every single day, almost like he was running on imperial autopilot. People used to joke that you could set your watch by the emperor, and they weren't kidding. Here's what a typical day would look like. He'd wake up early, really early, around 4 a.m. While most of Vienna was still snoring away, Franz Joseph was already sitting at his desk, going through piles of paperwork. And this wasn't glamorous emperor stuff like signing royal degrees with a golden quill. No, this was hours of mind-numbing government files, military reports, and bureaucratic nonsense. He genuinely believed it was his duty to personally read and sign almost everything. Imagine the world's most overcommitted boss who refuses to delegate anything. That was Franz. Breakfast? Simple. None of Sisi's weird meat juice or orange squeezing rituals here. He ate plain food, drank black coffee, and then went straight back to work. His staff used to complain that he never took a proper break. He'd just power through the day with military precision. Honestly, if Red Bull had existed back then, he would have been their poster child. And speaking of military precision, Franz adored the army. He wore his uniform constantly, even in private, and kept his body as disciplined as his mind. He wasn't eccentric like Sisi. He wasn't doing nightly veal masks or hiking 20 miles, but he was incredibly rigid about his appearance and his manners. His life was all about order, rules, and duty. The funny thing is, for all seriousness, people who worked with him described him as polite, patient, and approachable. He wasn't the kind of monarch who flew into rages or barked orders. He was calm, soft-spoken, and incredibly hardworking. Basically, he was the world's most reliable employee, except his job was ruling half of Europe. But here's the catch. That same sense of duty that made him admirable almost made him distant. With Sisi, especially, it was a huge problem. While she was desperate for freedom, travel, and emotional connection, Franz was chained to his desk. He couldn't understand her restlessness, and she couldn't understand his obsession with paperwork. It was like marrying an accountant, when what you really wanted was a poet. So yeah, if you picture Franz, don't imagine a glamorous emperor living it up in the palaces. Picture a guy sitting at a desk at 4 a.m., drinking black coffee, wearing his army uniform, and slogging through paperwork until his eyes glazed over. The man didn't just rule an empire, he lived for it, and that's exactly what made him both respected and kind of tragic. So now that we know who Franz was, rigid, disciplined, a man who lived for his empire, it's time to put him side by side with Sisi, because their marriage, let's just say it wasn't exactly a fairy tale. In fact, it was one of the strangest royal pairings in 19th century Europe. First off, Franz Joseph actually adored Sisi. He wasn't indifferent, he wasn't cold, he genuinely fell for her. Remember, he was originally supposed to marry her older sister, but when he met the 15-year-old Sisi, he was smitten. And throughout their marriage, he always treated her with affection, patience, and respect. The problem was, Sisi didn't really feel the same way. From the start, their personalities were completely mismatched. Franz Joseph was the empire's golden boy, disciplined, serious, married to his desk and his uniform. Sisi, meanwhile, was restless, romantic, and allergic to responsibility. He wanted her to play the traditional role of an empress, smiling at ceremonies, having babies, and acting as the perfect hostess at court. But for Sisi, that was basically her nightmare. The real villain in their marriage, though, wasn't Franz Joseph himself. It was his mother, Archduchess Sophie. Sophie was the ultimate mother-in-law from hell. She adored her son, but she treated Sisi like a silly little girl who wasn't fit to impress. Sophie constantly criticized her, took control of her children, and basically ran the palace. Franz Joseph, being the dutiful son, almost always sided with his mother. So Sisi, who already hated the stifling court life, found herself trapped between a husband she couldn't connect with and a mother-in-law who was basically her nemesis. Over time, the distance between them grew. Franz Joseph buried himself in his work, while Sisi buried herself in travel, beauty rituals, and her obsession with Hungary. They spent huge stretches of time apart, he in Vienna, she wandering across Europe. They weren't openly hostile, but they lived almost separate lives. To the outside world, they were the perfect imperial couple. Behind palace doors, they were strangers. And yet, here's the tragic part. Franz Joseph never stopped loving her. Even when she avoided him, even when she spent more time abroad than at home, he remained devoted. After her assassination, he was devastated. He famously said, "You do not know how much I love this woman." And in a way, that sums up their entire marriage. One man clinging to love and duty, and one woman desperately trying to escape both. So, if Sisi and Franz Joseph's marriage had been a modern rom-com, it would have been called something like The Workaholic and the Wanderer. Except instead of funny misunderstandings and a happy ending, it was two mismatched people stuck in the gilded cage of empire with no way out. And that really is the heart of Sisi's story. On the one hand, you have this dazzling, restless woman, obsessed with beauty, obsessed with freedom, desperate to escape the suffocating life of the 19th century empress. On the other, you have Franz Joseph, the embodiment of duty, discipline, and tradition, a man who could never quite understand his wife's wild spirit, but who loved her all the same. Their marriage was a constant push and pull. Franz Joseph, he wanted stability. Sisi, she wanted escape. He wanted her by his side at court. She wanted to vanish into the countryside, or better yet, to another country altogether. And in that tug of war, you can almost see the tragedy coming, because while he clung to his empire, she was slowly disappearing into herself. Her eccentricities, the veil masks, the extreme diets, the fans, the tattoos, the endless traveling, they weren't just quirks. They were coping mechanisms. They were her way of carving out some sliver of control in a life where every decision, every moment, every movement, every word was supposed to be dictated by her title. For all the glamour, Sisi was one of the loneliest women in Europe. And that loneliness followed her to the very end. By the time of her passing in 1898, she had almost become a shadow. She was always veiled, always hidden, always running from the spotlight she was born into. Her death was shocking, yes, but in a strange way, it almost fit the life she lived. A woman forever slipping through people's fingers, until one day, she was gone completely. Franz Joseph, he never truly recovered. He went on, ruling his empire with the same rigid discipline as before, but behind that uniform and that desk was a man who had lost the great love of his life, the one person he could never fully hold on to. So when we look back at Sisi today, what do we see? Not just the glamorous empress with the legendary hair or the eccentric habits, but a woman caught between duty and desire, love and loneliness, empire and escape. She was one of history's most fascinating contradictions, a queen who never actually wanted to be a queen, a beauty who tried to hide her face, a wanderer trapped in a palace. And maybe that's why she continues to captivate us even now, because behind all that glitter, Sisi wasn't just an empress. She was human, flawed, restless, eccentric, and in the end, heartbreakingly relatable. That's the end of this video, you guys. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, please consider giving this video a like and subscribe. And if you have any future topics you'd like me to cover, please drop a comment down below. And if you're still awake, I'll tend to the fire a little bit longer, hoping the crackling embers will put you to sleep. Good night. See you later.